My mother-in-law didn't know. I was the one paying the $5,500 rent. She told me to pack up and leave before my husband's baby arrived, so her son and his new family could move in. The next morning, I called the movers, canceled the lease under my name, and boxed up everything I owned. Then my phone exploded with her panicked calls. The audacity felt like a physical weight in the kitchen. David looked at his shoes while Margaret smirked. The silence confirmed his cowardice. I sat in my home office and pulled the digital lease. My name sat alone on the document. David had failed the credit check years ago. He never bothered to fix his score or contribute a dime. I had played the silent provider to keep his ego intact. Now, that ego was bringing another woman into my sanctuary. I tapped the termination button on the landlord's portal. A cold chill settled in my chest. The confirmation email arrived with a soft, final chime. The movers arrived at dawn with heavy plastic and cardboard. I pointed to the Italian leather sofa and the designer rug. They worked with mechanical speed. Every piece of furniture left a pale ghost on the hardwood floor. David's mistress had already picked out nursery colors for these rooms. She didn't know the walls would soon be stripped bare. I watched the dining table slide out the front door. The house began to echo with a hollow, hungry sound. I felt nothing. By noon, the kitchen was a skeleton of stainless steel. I had purchased every appliance, from the espresso machine to the custom range. Margaret had called them family heirlooms during brunch last week. Now, they were just heavy assets on a moving truck. I took the light bulbs from the recessed sockets. The rooms grew dim and gray under the midday sun. I left a single folding chair in the center of the foyer. It was the only thing David actually owned. The first call came as I pulled into my new driveway. Margaret's voice was a jagged blade through the speaker. She was standing in the empty living room. I could hear the panicked echo of her heels on the bare wood. She demanded to know where the refrigerator had gone. I told her it was in a climate-controlled unit miles away. Her breath hitched when I mentioned the lease termination. The power would be cut within the hour. She realized the trap was shut. I sat in my new living room and watched the sunset. My phone continued to buzz against the glass tabletop. David was finally calling. But I had already changed my number. He would find his pregnant girlfriend standing in a dark, empty house tonight. They had expected a turn-key life built on my labor. Instead, they inherited the debt and the shadows. I poured a glass of wine and toasted the silence. I was finally visible, and they were finally responsible for themselves. The wine tasted like victory and ash. I stared at the moving boxes stacked in my new hallway. Each cardboard cube held a piece of the life I had built for 3 ungrateful people. My hands were still shaking from the adrenaline of the exit. I needed to ensure the legal transition was airtight before the sun rose. I opened my laptop to check the utility status. Everything was scheduled to disconnect by midnight. The house was dying. The doorbell rang at my new apartment, shattering the quiet. I looked at the security camera and saw David's brother, Michael. He looked disheveled and frantic in the fish-eye lens. He was the one Margaret wanted to move in next. I didn't open the door. I watched him pace the narrow hallway of my building. He was shouting into his phone about a credit check. Apparently, the landlord had already rejected his application. He was effectively homeless. I checked my bank app to verify the final rent refund. The $5,500 was pending back into my savings account. This was the money Margaret assumed came from a family trust. She never bothered to ask how a social media manager could afford a Westchester estate. I felt a surge of cold pride in my financial independence. David had always mocked my spreadsheets and budget meetings. Now, those spreadsheets were the very tools of his total destruction. He had nothing. Michael finally left after kicking my door twice. I went to the window and watched his beat-up sedan peel away. The pressure was mounting on the entire Thornton clan. They were realizing that the family house was just a rental I controlled. I received an email from the landlord, Mr. Kowalski. He thanked me for the spotless move out but mentioned a problem. David was refusing to leave the premises. He was currently trespassing in a dark house. I called my lawyer, Sarah, to discuss the trespass issue. She advised me to stay away and let the authorities handle it. David was desperate and likely looking for the spare keys I had destroyed. I told her about the mistress and the impending baby. Sarah laughed and said that would make the eviction even faster. Judges in this county didn't appreciate squatters with zero income. The law was firmly on my side. I felt the power shift. A notification popped up from a neighbor's Ring camera next door. I saw Margaret pulling into the driveway with several suitcases. She looked ready to move into the guest suite I had gutted. She stepped onto the porch and tried her key. It turned, but the deadbolt I had installed held firm. She began pounding on the glass of the front door. I watched the scene in high-definition silence. She didn't realize the locks were changed. Suddenly, a police cruiser pulled into the frame behind her. Mr. Kowalski had wasted no time in reporting the unauthorized entry. Margaret turned around, her face pale under the strobe of blue lights. She pointed at the house and screamed about her son's rights. The officer didn't seem interested in her family drama. He reached for his handcuffs as David stepped out onto the porch. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. The mistress was in labor. The message from the mistress glowed on my screen like a warning flare. She was at the hospital alone because David was currently handcuffed on a dark porch. I felt a strange flicker of pity, but it was quickly extinguished by the memory of Margaret's smug face. My objective was now containment. I needed to ensure this new life didn't become my financial burden. I blocked the mistress's number immediately. The baby was David's responsibility, not mine. I felt a cold shiver as I realized she was just another piece of furniture to them. The police cruiser remained idling in the driveway as the officer checked David's identification. Through the grainy Ring feed, I watched Margaret sobbing against the brick siding of the house. She looked small and frail, without her designer scarves and expensive jewelry. David was arguing with the officer, gesturing wildly toward the empty windows. He looked like a madman claiming a kingdom that didn't exist. The officer didn't care about his lineage. He only cared about the lease. Mr. Kowalski called me again, his voice tight with irritation. He wanted the keys back by dawn, or he would charge for a full locksmith service. I told him I had already mailed them via overnight courier. He sighed and told me Margaret had offered him a gold watch to let her stay. He had refused, Because gold watches don't pay property taxes. The Thornton family was officially toxic. Even the neighborhood gossip was starting to churn online. I turned my attention to the forensic accounting file I had been building for months. I found a hidden account David had used to pay for the mistress's medical bills. He had been skimming from our joint grocery fund for over a year. It was a pathetic amount, barely $3,000. But it was enough for a fraud claim. I added the screenshot to the legal folder. This would be the final nail in our marriage. The power company sent a final confirmation text at midnight. The Westchester house was now officially off the grid. On the camera, I saw the porch lights flicker and die. Margaret let out a muffled shriek in the sudden darkness. The streetlights offered the only illumination for their defeat. David sat on the curb, his head in his hands. He looked like a stranger I had never known. The man I loved was gone. A second police car arrived to assist with the removal. The officers were being gentle, but firm with Margaret as they loaded her suitcases. She kept screaming my name into the night air, hoping I was listening. I was, but I wasn't responding. I was busy booking a one-way flight to the coast for a long weekend. I needed to be far away when the divorce papers were served. The house was a black hole now. As I closed my laptop, a final notification appeared on the screen. It wasn't from the family or the lawyer. It was a notification from a local news app. A fire had broken out in the neighborhood, just 3 doors down from the old house. The streets were being blocked off by emergency vehicles. If David and Margaret didn't leave now, they would be trapped in the smoke. The irony was a cold, sharp blade. My phone rang. The sirens wailing on the news app sounded eerily close to my reality. I grabbed my car keys with a trembling hand. My objective was simple. Get to the hospital to deliver the final legal papers before David could flee. The fire down the street was a chaotic backdrop to the Thornton family collapse. I pulled out of the garage, the engine purring in the quiet night. Behind me, the city glowed with an orange, unnatural light. The traffic near the hospital was a nightmare of flashing lights and hoses. Fire trucks blocked the main artery leading to the maternity ward. I felt the pressure mounting as my phone buzzed with a message from my lawyer. David was already trying to list me as the responsible party for the hospital bills. He was still trying to use my credit while the world burned around him. I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. I parked 3 blocks away and ran through the cold, damp air. The smell of smoke clung to my hair and clothes. Inside the lobby, the atmosphere was frantic due to the nearby emergency. I spotted Margaret sitting on a plastic bench, her face streaked with soot and tears. She looked up and gasped when she saw me. She thought I was there to save them. She didn't see the thick envelope in my right hand. "Gina." "Thank God," Margaret whispered, reaching out with a shaky hand. I stepped back, avoiding her touch with a sharp, calculated movement. The power balance shifted the moment I opened the envelope. I handed her the formal notice of lease termination and the restraining order. Her eyes widened as she read the words in the harsh fluorescent light. I wasn't her savior. I was the one closing the book. She realized she had nothing left to leverage. David emerged from the elevator, looking exhausted and disheveled. He saw me and stopped dead in his tracks. "The baby is here." he said, his voice cracking with a strange mixture of pride and fear. I didn't congratulate him. I simply handed him his copy of the divorce petition. He looked at the paper, and then at his mother. The reality of their shared homelessness finally crashed down. They were officially alone in a very expensive world. The mid-scene turn happened when a nurse approached us with a stern expression. She informed David that his credit card had been declined at the intake desk. The hospital required a deposit since he had no valid insurance on file. He turned to me with pleading eyes, but I remained silent and still. I had removed him from my policy 2 days ago. The financial safety net was gone. He was now just another stranger in the system. I walked toward the exit without saying another word. The cool night air felt like a benediction on my face. Behind me, I heard Margaret starting to argue with the hospital security guards. My phone vibrated with one last notification for the night. It was from my bank, alerting me to a large, unauthorized attempt to access my savings. David had tried my old password one last time. He failed. The fire was just beginning to spread. I drove away from the hospital as the fire department began to contain the blaze. My objective was to secure the remaining assets before David could recruit his brother for a raid. The nearby fire had turned the sky into a bruised purple. Ash fell like gray snow onto my windshield. I felt a cold surge of adrenaline as I navigated the back roads. The pressure was mounting. Every minute wasted was an opportunity for them to regroup. I reached my storage unit and found the lock undisturbed. Inside, the furniture from the Westchester house stood like silent monuments. I checked the serial numbers on the high-end appliances I had salvaged. Everything was accounted for and ready for resale. My phone buzzed with a notification from the bank. David's attempt to hack my savings had triggered a permanent account freeze. He was now locked out of every financial avenue. The walls were closing in on him. Suddenly, a pair of headlights cut through the darkness of the storage yard. A black sedan pulled up, blocking my exit path completely. I realized it was Michael, David's older brother, looking for a confrontation. He stepped out of the car with a heavy iron crowbar. He demanded I hand over the keys to the storage unit immediately. He claimed the furniture belonged to their family legacy. I didn't move. I simply hit the silent alarm button. The power balance shifted when I held up my phone screen to the window. I showed him the real-time GPS coordinates of the police units I had summoned. I had anticipated this move since the moment I left the house. Michael hesitated, the crowbar dipping toward the pavement. He realized I was 3 steps ahead of their desperate plan. His face twisted in a mask of pure, impotent rage. He was just another pawn in Margaret's failing game. "You're destroying us," Michael hissed, his voice cracking in the cold air. I told him they had destroyed themselves through years of arrogance. I didn't owe them a life of luxury built on my sweat. He looked at the high-end furniture behind me and finally saw the receipts. The realization hit him that they had never owned any of it. They were living in a beautiful, expensive lie. The sirens began to wail in the distance. The police arrived within minutes, their blue lights reflecting off the metal units. They detained Michael for trespassing and brandishing a weapon. I gave my statement with a calm, steady voice that surprised even me. The officer looked at the inventory list and whistled at the total value. I was officially protected by the law and my own foresight. Michael was led away in silence. I felt the last cord of the family snap. I locked the unit and walked toward my car, breathing the smoky air. The fire down the street was finally dying out. I felt a sense of finality as I checked my email one last time. A message from the landlord's attorney appeared at the top of my inbox. It wasn't about the rent or the move out. It was about a hidden basement they found in the old house. There was something inside that I didn't pack. The email from the landlord's attorney felt like a cold needle against my spine. I had lived in that house for 3 years without ever seeing a basement. My objective was to return to the property and claim whatever remained before the Thornton family could use it as leverage. I drove through the smoky remains of the neighborhood, my heart hammering against my ribs. The fire department had finally cleared the road. I pulled into the dark driveway, the house looming like a hollow skull. I found the hidden latch behind a loose panel in the utility room. It was a masterpiece of carpentry, nearly invisible to the untrained eye. My flashlight beam cut through the thick dust of the narrow stairs. The air grew heavy and damp as I descended into the earth. I expected spiders or old pipes, but I found a climate-controlled room instead. The silence down there was absolute and terrifying. I realized David had kept an entire wing of our lives hidden from me. The room was filled with stacks of unlabeled metal cases. I opened the first one and found thousands of dollars in loose cash. There were also ledgers detailing a series of offshore accounts in David's name. The pressure in my chest intensified as I flipped through the pages. This wasn't just a secret, it was a criminal enterprise. David hadn't been skimming from the grocery fund out of desperation. He had been hiding a massive fortune while I struggled to pay the rent. I heard the front door creak open upstairs, followed by the heavy thud of boots. David must have slipped away from the hospital or posted bail earlier than expected. I turned off my flashlight and pressed my back against the cold concrete wall. The footsteps moved toward the utility room with a rhythmic, knowing pace. He knew exactly where he was going. I was trapped in the very vault he used to deceive me for years. I gripped my phone tightly in the dark. The cellar door creaked open, and a sliver of light spilled down the stairs. "I know you are down there, Gina," David called out, his voice unnervingly calm. He didn't sound like the broken man I saw at the hospital. He sounded like a predator who had regained his footing. I stayed silent, my eyes adjusting to the dim light. I saw a secondary exit near the back of the vault. It was a small cold chute leading to the garden. I moved toward it. The power balance shifted when I realized David couldn't enter the vault without the keypad code. He was pounding on the reinforced steel door now, his composure finally breaking. He didn't know I had already photographed every ledger and every stack of currency. I had the evidence of his tax evasion and money laundering on my cloud drive. He was fighting for a room that was already empty of its power. I felt a surge of cold, calculated strength. I was the architect now. The police are already on their way back. "David!" I shouted through the steel. The pounding stopped instantly. I could hear his rag breathing on the other side of the door. He knew the fire down the street had brought half the precinct to our block. He was trapped in a house with no power and a basement full of federal crimes. I climbed into the coal chute and squeezed through the narrow opening. The cold night air hit my face like a clean slate. I scrambled out into the overgrown garden and ran for the fence. I reached my car just as 3 sirens began to scream from the main road. I didn't look back at the dark windows or the smoky sky. I drove straight to the police station to hand over the digital copies of the ledgers. The Thorntons were no longer just a family of entitled moochers. They were a liability that the state would now dismantle. I felt the last weight of my marriage evaporate. The detective at the station looked at the photos for less than a minute. He made a single phone call to the federal authorities. I sat in the lobby and drank a cup of bitter, scorched coffee. The sun was beginning to peek over the horizon, painting the world in shades of gray. I was tired. But the path forward was finally clear and unobstructed. David was going to lose more than just a house. He was going to lose his freedom. I checked my phone one last time before heading to a hotel. There was a single text message from Margaret that had slipped through the block. It wasn't an insult or a plea for money this time. It was a photo of a legal document I didn't recognize. It was a birth certificate for David. But the father's name was someone I knew well. The landlord, Mr. Kowalski, was actually David's biological father. The entire eviction had been a staged play for a much darker inheritance. The revelation about Mr. Kowalski felt like a heavy stone dropped into a still pond. I stared at the birth certificate on my phone while sitting in the police lobby. My objective was now to confront the landlord and sever the final financial tie before he could protect David. If Kowalski was the father, the lease termination was just a minor inconvenience to them. They were likely planning to transfer the property title in secret. I had to move faster than their bloodline. I drove back toward the Westchester estate as the sun began to burn through the morning haze. The smoke from the nearby fire had settled into a low, acrid fog. I saw Kowalski's silver sedan parked near the garden gate where I had escaped. He was talking to Margaret, his hand resting familiarly on her shoulder. The image of their domestic conspiracy made my blood run cold. They were celebrating the birth of a grandson while I was being hunted. I parked. I stepped out of the car, clutching the folder of offshore ledgers. Margaret saw me first and her expression shifted from relief to a guarded mask. Kowalski didn't look surprised to see me. He looked disappointed, like a teacher dealing with a difficult student. I realized he had probably been the one who suggested the sub-basement vault. He wasn't just a landlord. He was the silent architect of David's criminal fortune. The pressure was suffocating. I felt the trap. "You should have stayed away, Gina," Kowalski said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. He took a step toward me, but I didn't retreat. I opened the folder and showed him the first page of the federal transaction logs. The power balance shifted instantly. I wasn't just an ex-wife with a grudge anymore. I was a whistleblower with the power to seize his entire real estate empire. He froze, his gaze darting to the police station 3 miles away. He knew the risk. "I know everything," I said, my voice steady despite the hammer of my heart. I explained that the federal authorities were already reviewing the digital copies of the vault's contents. Margaret let out a soft, whimpering sound and reached for Kowalski's arm. She was realizing that her son's secret inheritance was now a radioactive liability. The house, the money, and the legacy were all tied to the same sinking ship. Kowalski's eyes turned hard and cold. He was calculating the cost of my silence. The mid-scene turn happened when Kowalski pulled a second phone from his pocket. He didn't call the police or a lawyer. He opened a remote monitoring app that controlled the house's internal security. A sharp, high-pitched alarm began to blare from the empty structure behind us. He had triggered a self-destruct sequence in the vault's climate control system. He was willing to burn the cash to hide the evidence. I watched the windows frost over as the nitrogen gas pumped into the cellar. Evidence is only useful if it exists, he whispered, a cruel smile touching his lips. He thought he had outsmarted me by destroying the physical bills. He didn't realize that the ledgers I held were more dangerous than the currency itself. Those numbers proved the origin of his wealth, not just the possession of it. I felt a surge of triumph as the sirens returned to the neighborhood. They were coming for him this time. He had finally overplayed his hand. David stumbled out of the front door, gasping for air and clutching his chest. The gas from the basement was leaking into the ventilation system. He looked at his father and then at me, confusion clouding his wary eyes. He didn't know about the nitrogen or the impending federal raid. He only knew that the world he built on lies was collapsing. He fell to his knees on the manicured lawn. The perfect family image was permanently shattered. I felt no pity. The police arrived with federal agents in tow, their black SUVs blocking the driveway. They moved with military precision, pinning Kowalski against his silver sedan. Margaret began to scream about her rights, but her voice was drowned out by the chaos. I handed the physical ledgers to an agent with a gold badge. He nodded at me, recognizing the value of the paper over the burned gas. The Thornton legacy was officially dead. I stepped back into the shadows. I walked to my car as the agents began to cordon off the entire property. David was being loaded into an ambulance, his face covered by an oxygen mask. I saw Margaret being led away in plastic zip ties, her designer shoes scuffing the dirt. I realized I had finally achieved the impossible. I had made myself seen by disappearing entirely. I pulled away from the curb without a single glance back. My phone buzzed. The notification from my bank confirmed the final wire transfer of my security deposit. I stared at the screen while sitting in the quiet luxury of my new apartment. My objective was finally realized. I was financially decoupled from the Thornton catastrophe. The feds had seized the Westchester house and frozen Kowalski's local assets. David was facing decades in prison for the laundering operation I had uncovered. I finally felt the phantom weight of their expectations lift. The silence was absolute. David sent a letter from the county jail 3 weeks later. He didn't ask for forgiveness or try to explain the hidden basement. He only wanted to know where I had hidden his grandfather's gold signet ring. It was a pathetic request from a man who had lost his entire future. I remembered seeing the ring in a box of junk I donated to charity. I didn't write back. I let the letter sit on my counter until the ink faded. Margaret tried to call me from a prepaid phone on a rainy Tuesday. Her voice was thin and brittle, stripped of its former aristocratic polish. She was living in a state-funded shelter, after Kowalski disowned her to save himself. She begged for a small loan to get through the month. I listened to her breathe for a long minute, before hanging up. I realized that my silence was the only language she understood now. She was finally truly invisible. The new family David had planned never actually materialized in the wreckage. The mistress had vanished with the baby shortly after the federal raid began. She was smarter than the rest of them, and saw the collapse coming. I saw a social media post of her, in a different city with a new name. She had escaped the Thornton curse, just like I had. David was a father to a shadow he would never hold. The cycle was broken. I spent my Saturday morning at a local gallery buying art for my bare walls. I chose a large abstract piece with bold strikes of blue and gold. It was expensive, but I didn't have to ask anyone for permission. I paid with my own card and smiled at the cashier. The clerk complimented my taste and asked if I lived nearby. I told him I was new to the area. I was a woman starting from scratch. As I hung the painting, my phone buzzed with an alert from a private investigator. He had found a second vault location in a city 500 miles away. The GPS coordinates were attached to a photo of a familiar silver sedan. Kowalski wasn't in custody yet, and he was currently moving more metal cases into a garage. The war wasn't over. It had simply moved to a larger map. I picked up my keys and headed for the door.